I'm sure you've all heard of zombie games, and they're all fun to a certain extent. But when you have a game that has infected rather than zombies, with a very fun narrative, you have a game that is all around very fun with a great emotional story. Last of Us Part 2 is a sequel set 4 years after the first game, and many people hated it based on a few things that they didn't like, totally forgetting about the things that made the game so great. As I've said, most people have played or at least heard of zombie games, but in this game, they're called infected because they're not dead, and they've been infected with the cordyceps virus. I first played The Last of Us in 2017, and it's been my favorite game ever since then. And I was ecstatic to hear that they'd be releasing a Part 2, which came out in June of this year, and I've been playing it almost non-stop ever since then. This goes without saying, but major spoilers follow for The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2, and if you want to play either of these games, don't watch my speech. The Last of Us takes place 20 years after the outbreak of the cordyceps virus, and it chronicles the story of one Joel and Ellie. Joel is a 50-year-old man, and Ellie's a 14-year-old girl. A few weeks before the events of the game, Ellie is bitten by another infected, and she somehow shows no signs of infection, and she's somehow immune to the virus. Joel is then tasked with taking Ellie across the country to a group called the Fireflies, so then doctors can experiment on her and find out if maybe they can even get a vaccine from her. Joel doesn't like Ellie in the beginning of the game because she puts him in danger, but as the game goes on, you see the relationship mend into a very beautiful one, and it looks like that they've been father and daughter for almost 10-15 years, even though they've known each other for just a few months. Towards the end of the game, they finally reach the Fireflies, and the doctors take Ellie from Joel, and Joel has a conversation with the leader of the Fireflies. And in this conversation, Joel finds out that the doctors will be removing the tumor from Ellie's brain that makes her immune to the virus, and using that to reverse engineer a vaccine. And Joel does not like this at all because it would kill her in the end. Joel then escapes custody from the Fireflies and saves Ellie before the doctors can operate on her, and wiping out all the Fireflies that come in his way. At the end of the game, they both share one last conversation. In this conversation, Joel lies to Ellie, saying that the Fireflies could not get a vaccine from her because it was just not possible at the time. And he says this because 20 years ago, when the outbreak occurred, he lost his one and only daughter to a human being, not even another infected, and that solidified the fact for him that the world doesn't care about him, so why should he care about the world? In an emotional ending, Ellie makes Joel swear to her that he told the truth about the Fireflies, and he does exactly that. The Last of Us paves the way for Part 2, and the story picks up pretty much where the first game left off. The Last of Us Part 2 takes place 4 years after the events of the first game, except for the beginning, in which Joel promised Ellie in the first game, he gives her a guitar and then teaches her how to play. When the present day starts in the game, Ellie is shown to be living in a nice town, but on that same day they show, Joel is ambushed by a group of people from another city, and he's brutally murdered with a golf club by a girl named Abby and her group of friends. Ellie sets herself on revenge and follows this group back to their home in Seattle. Once she reaches Seattle, she one by one starts killing all the people who came into her city and killed Joel. Towards the end of her stay in Seattle, Ellie confronts two of Abby's friends, a man and a woman, and tries to get them to tell her where Abby is. But when they refuse to tell her, she, without thinking, kills them both. And she shortly after finds out that the woman was actually pregnant. And this makes Ellie feel very, very guilty. And this is also the reason why she decides to leave Seattle early rather than going after Abby. And before she can actually leave Seattle, she's actually ambushed by Abby, and the game shows Abby pointing a gun at Ellie's face, and then the screen goes black. We then start to control Abby 4 years before the events of the game, and in this flashback, it is shown that the doctor that Joel killed in the first game is actually Abby's father, and she set herself on the same course of revenge that Ellie has, except it took her 4 years to find Joel because she never met him and she never knew about him. Fast forward 4 years to the same day that Ellie reaches Seattle, Abby is making her way across the city when she's ambushed by a nearby cult who hangs and stones their people who are not in their group. And when she's on the news in the middle of the night, she is saved by two kids, a boy and a girl, who are both running away from the cult. And in the middle of the night, she saves them both after they save her from a bunch of infected and the nearby cult. And she finds them a safe place to spend the night, but not before finding out that the girl's arm was hammered in. Abby then decides to save both the kids and save the girl's life by getting medical supplies so that her pregnant friend can perform surgery and remove the arm so that the girl can live. After they save the girl's life, the boy runs away to get his mom to join Abby and her friends. but since the mom is still a cult member, the girl and Abby decide to go after him and save his life. While on their way there, the girl dies, but Abby and the boy safely make it back to Seattle, and when they get back, they find that two of Abby's friends have been killed. After this, they finally get to Ellie and they ambush her, and the game shows the same scene that happened halfway through the game. And in this scene, Abby and Ellie have a fight, and Abby gains the upper hand and almost kills Ellie, but she decides to let her go, letting her go on her way and letting her live. A few months after this, Ellie is shown to be suffering from severe PTSD, and she decides to find Abby to get over the death of Joel. When she finally finds Abby, she finds that she is tied to a pillar in the middle of some lake. And instead of leaving her on the pillar, she decides to cut her down so that she can kill her. And they have one last fight, but at the beginning of the fight, Abby bites two of Ellie's fingers off, and Ellie has her hands around Abby's throat, ready to kill her. But right before she's about to kill her, she has a vision of Joel playing the guitar on his porch, which prompts Ellie to let Abby go and stop this circle of violence. When she gets back to her home, she finds that her girlfriend left her and took all of their belongings, except for her guitar. And she tries to play the guitar one more time, but then she realizes she can't because she's missing her both left pinky finger and her left ring finger. The game then ends with her leaving the guitar in the windowsill and her walking out of her yard, with the camera panning from the guitar to Ellie walking out. The Last of Us Part 2 may not be as good as its predecessor, but it was still a very great game, and I think a sequel that held up to expectations. Certainly not expectations of many people, though. As I said before, many people don't like The Last of Us Part 2 because of a few things, totally forgetting about the things that make the game so great. For example, at the start of the game when Joel died, many people did not like the way they showed Joel dying because he died like he was nothing. But in a world like that, nothing good ever happens, and if you do something bad, there has to be consequences, and obviously there were for Joel, because from the point of view of the Fireflies and Abby, they thought that Joel ruined the whole world because they ruined their one chance to get a vaccine. But when you think about it from Joel's perspective, it makes sense that he did what he did because of his daughter that died 20 years ago. And I mean, I have to admit too, Joel is my favorite character in any sort of media, and I felt some pain when I saw him die. Another reason that people don't like this game is because the creators make us play as Abby for as long as they make us play as Ellie. And a lot of people just didn't like Abby just for the sole fact that she killed Joel. And I mean, I have to admit, I also felt that way too, but after playing the game a few times, I started to realize the importance of her story, and I started to love her for who she really is. Another reason that people didn't really like this game was that the creators of the game tried to make us sympathize with Abby's story. And I thought they did a pretty good job with this because Abby is also shown to have severe PTSD, which she has been suffering for all the 4 years. She always has nightmares which wake her up at night, and she gets up like shaking and just surprising herself. And in the end, she can only stop that by killing Joel, but even this does not stop her recurring nightmares. And the only way it stops is when she saves both the kids from the nearby cult. Another reason is that Ellie is simply a mere shell of the person she used to be in the first game and the beginning of the second. She goes on her way for revenge and decides to leave away her girlfriend and the family that they have made and the life they have for themselves. But because she is so hell-bent on getting revenge for Joel's death, she decides to throw everything away that's important to her. And then again, in this type of world, you have to be thankful for what you have because the world is very, very unpredictable and you don't know what is around each corner. One last reason that people did not really like this game is because of how the characters were portrayed in this game. In the first game, the characters that were all the side characters in the game were all portrayed very as unique people and all strong in their own ways. And they were pretty important to the core story of the first game. But in the second game, they were all kind of bland and seemed all common. But in the end, I feel like the side characters of this game were not as important because the game is obviously based on the actions of Ellie and Abby. All in all, I think people set the bar way too high for this game, setting their expectations like for it to be the first game, and if it was anywhere below that bar, they would instantly hate it. Today, I talked about The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2, why the second game was hated so much, but why it was still very good with a very complex story. I think people just expected it to be just like the first game, but in the end, it was a very, very different game. And in interviews leading up to the release of Part 2, Many of the creators talked about how the game was going in a way different direction than the first game, and people just seemed not to listen. Even though people thought that the storytelling was the worst part of this game, I honestly thought that it had a really great narrative with a very complex story to it. The Last of Us will go down in history as one of the greatest games of all time. Maybe Part 2 will never be anywhere close, but it's still a masterpiece that no game will ever come close to. Thank you.